Hello Grandmasters, it's Mike from the WCA. We're going to take a look at a game that was played by one of our older students who is now an expert, rated almost 2100, playing against a 1900 player. So these are two pretty good chess players going at it for you. And there's a couple of things we want you to look for in this game. A little hint going into the lesson: don't try to learn too much the first time through. You're going to hear a lot of words, especially the younger students might not understand from chess. For example, the word transposition. You would learn the difference between an open and a closed Sicilian defense. What an isolated pawn is. You're going to hear something called an exchange sacrifice. So the older players or the higher rated players naturally know what all these things are. But the newer players, please don't feel overwhelmed by the information. Your job is basically to sit back, take the game in, learn what you can from it, and then come to class with some questions. That's really the best way to take advantage of the program. You can't learn it all in one go. So sit back, watch the game. Any questions, take your notes, and then come into class. Okay? All right, so let's take a look. The WCA student has the white pieces and begins with e4. It starts as a French defense, and after d4, which is the natural move from white, black kind of throws a little trick at white and plays the move c5. We're not going to get into the opening reason why it's played, but black is asking white if you want to go by transposition into a Sicilian defense, which he did by playing the move knight f3, or do you want to play something else, like take my pawn on c5, or play some sideline in the French. But white decides to go straight ahead into an open Sicilian. Now, an open Sicilian comes about from these structures when black trades his c-pawn, as you can see happening here, for white's d-pawn. And what happens when you make that trade is the board begins to open up. In a regular Sicilian, if white decides to put a pawn on d3 and not play pawn to d4, the position would remain closed. So here you're taking a look at the beginning of an open Sicilian, and again that's because the d file is open and the trade of black's c-pawn for the d-pawn has taken place. That's really the key. So from here, black plays knight f6, attacking the e-pawn. White protects the pawn with knight c3, and then a knight c6 in this Sicilian, which allows white to break one of the rules that you've heard about, especially when you are lower rated, and that kind of more of a concept than a rule. And that says don't move the same piece twice in the opening unless you have a good reason. Well, it turns out white has a good reason and moves the d knight into b5. Now take a moment to look at what that knight is threatening. It's not a major threat, but it could be a real nuisance. For example, if you were to chase that knight with pawn a6 and the knight hops into d6, you'll notice that your king is going to move to a really bad square. You don't want to move him to e7. And if you take with your bishop on f8, you're going to invite the white queen inside, and it might be a little bit difficult to castle, and you could have some problems along those dark squares. So one of the moves in this position, and it was played by the WCA opponent, was to pin the knight on c3. And by pinning the knight, white decided to go straight ahead into a line that we had looked at a camp a year earlier, and we thought turned out to be pretty good for white. And his answer was to immediately attack the bishop. Bishop takes knight, knight takes bishop. And it's this point where we really want to start a discussion in this short video. And basically, looking at this position, it appears that the player with the black pieces somehow got ahead. And that, in fact, is true because white has moved that knight on c3. Well, you can count for yourself how many times it's moved. 3 times. And by moving the same piece 3 times, it's allowed black to actually catch up and appear to be ahead in development, which he is. He has 2 knights out and a pawn, and white only has the knight on c3 and the 2 pawns. And don't forget, it's black's turn to move. So then the question would naturally arise, why would white go for this if they would fall behind? Well, take a look. Basically, a lot of it has to do with the two bishops that are still kind of hanging out at the bottom of the board. You can focus your attention on the king's bishop on f1, the queen's bishop on c1, and you'll notice that black has traded off his dark squared bishop. At this very moment, that might not be a big deal, but as the game progresses, if the board tends to open, then some of those dark squares on the black side can become weak and attacked by the bishop. And in that case, black would kind of feel, or miss rather, the bishop that he just traded off. So in this position, it's kind of a balanced game. Black is a little bit ahead in development, and at the same time, white has those two bishops for compensation. Okay, so let's see what happened. Black plays in this position a very standard idea. When you're ahead in development, try to push and open the game. Create some activity, and hopefully your extra pieces will do something as the board begins to open up. So in the game, white takes, black takes, and that creates what we call an isolated pawn position. And I'll highlight that for you. If you look at the black pawn on d5, it's isolated now, meaning there are no friendly pawns on either side of it to protect it. So if it begins to get attacked as the middle game takes place, it could easily fall, because the only things that can protect that pawn are the black pieces. And that can occasionally turn those pieces into babysitters. So if black cares about that pawn, the pieces may have to lay back to protect it. Now, there's a real positive to having that isolated pawn. If you focus your eyes directly on that pawn and just keep staring at it, you'll begin to see the open space that's surrounded it. Well, if black gets castled, black can use that open space for his pieces and use those open spaces to attack the white side of the board. However, there's a slight problem here, and I think that's one of the reasons black doesn't go in for this line that often. And the problem is, black is opening the game, but by doing so, he's really increasing the scope of the two white bishops. At the WCA, we tell the students to always count the number of center pawns. When a game begins, you begin with 4. 2 for white, 2 for black. In this position, and it's early, it's only move 9 here, 3 of those center pawns have disappeared. Well, if you think about it, the more the board opens, the more the bishops kind of come into their own. They become very strong because the diagonals open. And if they open, that means there's no pawns on them. Without pawns there, the knights tend to feel a little uncomfortable because they like pawns to support them. They protect them as they take advanced squares, but without those middle pawns, sometimes the knights kind of sit back and have a problem. So there's an arrow quickly. And the reason the arrow's there is this is the kind of position a lot of our students struggle with. Because the pawns are not in contact, it's very difficult to plan where your pieces are going to go. And as I mentioned before, for example, the knights not having too many support squares, it's not easy to figure out, hey, what am I supposed to do with my pieces? So here's the hint, and this is probably the main idea we want you to get out of this video. When you find yourself in a position where planning is not clear to you and it's not easy, make moves that activate your pieces. Don't push the pawns because it's not clear where the pawns belong. You can't break against the opponent's pawns. It's not really the time here, clearly, to try to push a pawn to make a queen. You're not anywhere near an endgame. So when you find yourself in a position like this with a wide open board, think about your king safety first. The e-file is wide open. Look at the arrow. So then, if you follow that little hint, let's get the pieces out quickly. So white played this game according to what he had learned at some of the WCA classes, and he plays bishop to d3. We've had people look at this game and say, well, hey, why not bishop to b5? Doesn't that seem more active attacking the knight? It does, but you have to be a little careful here. For example, what if black pushes back and hits your pawn, your knight rather? You have to be careful here. You may be forced to play the move bishop takes knight on c6, giving up one of your two bishops. The problem with knight e2 is you'll see I highlighted the bishop for you on b5, and you'll notice that it's loose, and that means it's not protected. So it shouldn't take many of you too long to figure out that queen a5 is going to be a problem, and you might lose a piece in this position. So that's why white plays bishop to d3. Black naturally castles here. Great idea. Let's get the king out of the middle, and the rooks can begin to battle for the center. And white shouldn't have a problem finding a move like castling. Keep the pieces coming out and keep the king safe. Again, don't push the pawns unless you have a reason not to develop a piece here. And that's exactly what black does. So we can't really call h6, his next move, a mistake, although it's not really following in with the concept of getting the pieces out quickly in these unclear positions. Let me give you a sample line of a game that was played between two masters from this, grandmasters actually. GM with black, instead of playing pawn h6, played pawn d4. And that's a stronger move for several reasons. Aside from attacking the knight on c3 and making it move, in the game the knight went to e2, it's beginning to take a little bit more space. As the pawn pushes forward, you have more room behind it. Bishop f3 came, pinning the knight to the queen. Pawn f3, attacking the bishop, which went to h5. All natural moves. Bishop g5 by white. Queen d6, breaking the pin all by herself without damaging the pawns. And I want you to take a quick glance here at the highlights. There's lots of them. Look at the two black rooks. They're connected. Look at the queen, protecting both knights, nearly in the center of the board, so she's got her eye on a ton of squares. The white bishop that was on c8 has now moved all the way to h5, and at some point might come into g6 to challenge the strong white bishop on d3, and the black king is obviously safe. And that pawn that was on d5, which is also highlighted on d4, is giving black, as we mentioned before, more space. So that's the way we really like our students to play their positions. Actively, full development, and again, especially in positions where the pawns are not in contact. Now let's go back to see what black played in the game. h6. And your first reaction after seeing that from this is the lack of development. Again, this is the move that was played in the game. Look at the bishop on c8. Matter of fact, look at all the black pieces on the top row, and then compare it quickly to this. And you'll see what we're trying to get you to do. If you're confused, don't overthink the positions. Get the guys out. It's a great expression to remember. Just get them out. Okay, so after h6, white, there's nothing to take here. There's no great tactic. So white just plays a very natural, good developing move. Bishop f4. And we think from the opponent's conversation after the game, the reason he plays a6 here, and again, that's another pawn move, was he was thinking of posting his queen on c7 someday, you know, providing that bishop on f4 moves, and he somehow wanted to prevent knight to b5. And when we asked him, he really wasn't clear, but it turned out that in this position, you obviously weren't going to put your queen on c7 anyway, so it almost gave white a free move. Again, just look at the bishop on f4, and even a move like bishop e6 here at some point could certainly help. You have to get the pieces out. So let's return to a6, and again, white follows the simple rule of take squares, develop the pieces. Plays rook e1, taking the whole e-file, and here knight to e7 was played. Now, that knight moved for a reason. And one thing we'd like to recommend to you is whenever your opponent moves a piece, ask yourself, what new square is that piece protecting or attacking? So in this case, if I highlight the f5 square, you'll see that black has the idea of maybe playing bishop to f5, but our student was ready for that. Now, first of all, why bishop f5? Well, if black can play bishop f5 and challenge the white bishop, perhaps you can take some of the pressure off your king, because if you look carefully at the bishop on d3, it's pointing in the direction of the black king. So a move like queen d2, which is what happened in the game, kind of prevents bishop f5, and there's a tactical reason. Let me show you. If you play bishop f5, white will surprise you with an exchange sacrifice, and this is pretty common at the higher level, but as a new up-and-coming player, it's a trick you might not be familiar with. The knight on e7 is protecting the bishop on f5, so why not take it? If the queen takes that rook, then the bishop on f5 is going to fall, so black will pretty much go for that bishop, taking yours on d3, but you have a nice in-between move. You grab a pawn. And when you take that pawn on b7, the bishop on d3 is hanging, so it'll run away, let's say to g6, and then you simply take your last piece and maybe gang up on that pawn. And white's doing pretty well. You have a pawn, and it's looking pretty good. So after knight e7, let's go back, white simply follows through with queen d2. Now I want to show you how quickly a game can end from this position. Being that bishop f5 was out of the question, black plays knight to g6, attacking our bishop. Big question we get from a lot of the students is, when is it okay to trade a knight for a bishop? Well, there's tons of reasons, and we wouldn't go into them all now, but here's a simple hint for you in a position like this. Look at the dark squares. Whenever you have the option of trading off one of your bishops, look at the color that that bishop is controlling or attacking or working on. If that bishop has an opportunity or is controlling lots of squares, keep the piece. Just keep that bishop. If you have a tactical reason to trade it, for example, if you make a trade and then win a pawn or do something like that, then by all means trade it off. But if you don't allow your opponent to take that bishop off, because black doesn't have a dark square bishop. And if anything ever happens on the dark squares, you're going to really wish that you still have the piece. As a matter of fact, when you see how this game ends, you'll see that white was very happy not to trade. So he just simply retreats and then tells black, okay, what do you want to do here? And black actually retreats the knight back to e7 and offers our student a draw. Should he take it? Well, what would you do? Would you take a draw here as white? Well, he certainly didn't, and his reason was basically those two bishops, the queen, the rook on e1, they all have access to the black king. They can get over there pretty quickly, and it's not really clear what the black pieces are doing. So he had absolutely no intention of trading. So what he decided to do instead is try to break the pawns in front of the black king. Now he would take that knight on f6, and by doing so it would force black to take back, shatter the pawns. The pawn on h6 would probably fall. And to prevent that, well, it didn't really prevent it because he gets in trouble anyway, but he played queen d6 thinking his structure would be okay, except he missed something. Just quickly, let's take a look at if he decides to go after, putting the rook on the e-file. Here's a cute little tactical trick. We take on f6, pawn takes, and this is obviously bad for black. I'm just showing you because there's a pattern I want you to see. We can now take on h6, which threatens a very common, useful checkmating pattern. And after queen d6, white now has mate in 4. So what we'd like you to do is pause the video and solve it. Okay, let's see how you did. Here it is, and this is a real common mating attack. Bishop h7 check keeps the king inside that little box. He's forced to go under the bishop. You move the bishop to g6 with a discovered check. King has to go to g8, and now a very simple mate in 2. queen h7, king f8, and mate on f7. Very, very common. Okay, so in the game after queen d6, black thought he was preventing all that by just protecting the knight with the queen, but he missed white's idea. Very common sacrifice, and here a pretty cool one. Nice to see one of our students find the move. Rook takes e7. Very strong move. It's a piece, and once the queen takes back, you'll notice that she walks into that pin from the bishop on h4. So I guess you guys are glad you kept that piece on the board. And black is in big, big trouble now. After the queen takes, the white knight that's been quiet on c3 jumps into the action, grabs a pawn, and you can see that if you take, which is probably black's best move, believe it or not, you're going to lose your queen and be down a little bit of material. A cute little line, though. Say queen b4 sets a little trap. For example, let's say black wants to move the knight to avoid a trade, or obviously losing the piece for nothing, and plays a move like knight c6. In this position, cute little move. Why can't we just take the rook on f8? Well, it's because the king's there. So wouldn't it be nice if he wasn't there? Well, how about bishop h7 check? Ouch, that hurts. Yeah, active queen, active bishop, you're going to run into problems. So anyway, let's go back. After the exchange sacrifice, the queen takes, the knight takes, hitting the queen. Queen goes to e5, and the game ends very, very quickly. Knight took on f6, check. You know, the computer will tell you the king should just move, that it's useless taking the knight because it's really over at this point. But, you know, humans are just not going to give up a piece for nothing. They know they're lost anyway, so he takes. And then very, very simple checkmate. Just look at the weak squares around the king. You take h6 for free. And again, the reason we're showing it to you is, what if black makes an escape square for the king and plays rook e8? Well, there's the same mate in 4 that you had before, beginning with bishop h7 check. We're not going to show you the rest. We want you to work it out for yourself. But from this position, you should be able to calculate mate in 4. So the game continuation after queen takes h6 was bishop f5. And that was just to protect the h7 square. But at this point, it didn't really help because black just takes on f6. And there's that dark squared bishop. Kind of glad we didn't trade it. And that threatens the queen. That threatens mate on g7. And in this position, black resigned. All right, I hope you enjoyed the game and the video. Work hard, solve your puzzles, and we'll see you at class this Sunday.